Hi, I'm Rob Johnson, the president of the Institute for New Economic Thinking. I'm here to talk with Orville Schell, the director of the Center of U.S.-China Relations at the Asia Society in New York. In particular today, we're here to talk about his exciting new book, Wealth and Power, China's Long March into the 21st Century. Thanks for joining us.
Pleasure.
So, when I read this book, I felt that you got to what they call the heart of the matter. And the heart of the matter is illustrated in the opening scene where Wei Yuan is the intellectual and the temple of the Tranquil Sea, where the rather hideous Unequal treaty to end the First Opium War was signed. So you start this book with Chinese humiliation. Why is that where you launch this conversation?
Well, it's funny. I think in a certain way, the First Opium War, and there were sort of two major ones, really was the beginning of a final act of sort of ancient Chinese history, because it represented the arrival of the West on the scene, and suddenly China having to compare itself, I mean literally, because it had to militarily defend itself, to this sort of the power of the West, which was just coming out of in the Industrial Revolution. And so in a certain sense, this was sort of the prime shock of modern Chinese history.
And you say in the book that the last act was when Commissioner Lin confiscated the opium, mixed it with brackish or saline water, and burned it.
Yeah.
Which you might call the final triumph of the nation.
It was a logical response. Britain had been buying tea and porcelain and silk from China and been hemorrhaging silver.
So their balance of payments was
was in deficit. So they discovered, much to their surprise and gratification, that if they imported opium from India, the East India Company, into China, they would then improve their balance of payments and continue to be able to import all this tea, porcelain, silk, etc. But of course the Chinese took a rather jaundiced view of having their entire nation addicted just to improve England's balance of payments. So Lin Zexu, the commissioner in Canton, did what any august official would have done. He confiscated the opium, took it off to a tidal estuary, mixed it with seawater and lime, and chemically incinerated it. And this is what precipitated China's confrontation with the West in the First Opium War.
And where they learned about that industrial revolution and that foreign power was through the naval power of the British Empire. And as they came up the Yangtze River, up to Nanking, where this treaty was signed, where your opening scene at the temple. It's almost a hilarious name to call it the Temple of Tranquil Sea.
Yeah, this was a wake-up call for China. They were badly defeated, and what they were running up against, although they didn't really understand it at the time, was the new industrial and technological might of a Promethean dynamic West. It was based on burning carbon, coal, steel, cannons, and at the Temple of the Tranquil Seas up the Yangtze River in Nanjing, this is where the HMS Cornwallis anchored, and in that small temple forced China to sign the first unequal treaty, the first of many that every great power forced China to sign. And this was the beginning of this incredible fall from grace of this society, this country, which had for millennia never been challenged by anybody.
Considered itself the Central Kingdom, the greatest civilization on earth, and perhaps rightfully so.
And at least insofar as the world that they knew, which was Asia. And every country that related to China certainly did not do so as an equal, but as an inferior. They would come to Beijing as part of what was called the tribute system. They would sit in Beijing in a special dormitory with their giraffes and their whatever they brought from their country as a gift to the emperor. When the emperor deigned to see them, they would come in, offer their gifts, and in return for that status, inferior status as a tribute-bearing nation, would, you know, they could imbibe Chinese culture to some degree. China would sort of be the ringmaster of the whole Asian kind of circus. But suddenly arrives England demanding to have equal diplomatic representation. It had never happened before. And it was profoundly humiliating that they couldn't just simply push these people, who they named barbarians. There's a word in Chinese, yi, which was applied to, you know, Mongols, Manchurians, you know, Muslim tribesmen, you know, lesser cultural beings who from time to time would flood over the Great Wall. But here was this different kind of barbarian that was not just on horseback and technologically primitive, but powerful. And it began this century and a half of this bitter, bitter recognition of China's weakness. But never during those many decades of failure was there any subsidence in terms of their desire to restore themselves to greatness. And in a certain sense then, the entire sweep of modern Chinese history is this effort to reinvent China, to restore it to a place of wealth, power, greatness, consequence, respect. There are many words you can use.
And you spoke of their awareness of their, what you might say, advancement or superiority in Asia. A little bit later in time, the, how would I say, humiliation felt at the hands of British was superseded by humiliation at the hands of the Japanese.
Double humiliation, I
yes.
might add.
Right.
British were Caucasian from far away, over the edge of the world. The Japanese, on the other hand, were always assumed to be China's younger and, I should say, lesser brother. They were part of the tribute system. Mm-hmm. They borrowed Chinese culture. They borrowed Confucian culture, calligraphy, art. And so when Japan began to develop successfully during the Meiji Restoration in the latter part of the 19th century, and China was still foundering in its sort of conservative paralysis, this was bitter indeed. But when in 1895, Japan beat China in the Sino-Japanese War, that was, and sunk the entire Chinese Navy, this was a pill even more bitter.
Yes.
And that was the beginning of this tremendous antipathy and jealousy of Japan, this younger, inferior power. They used to refer to them as warren, as dwarf pirates, who triumphed. And ultimately in the 30s, then 40s, came to militarily occupy China.
And one of the leading figures, and I must say, one of the things I found most beautiful about your book is how you used political, intellectual, literary figures to illustrate the state of mind, or what you might call the leading narrative of each era as you tell this story. But one of those that stands out is Sun Yat-sen, who's educated in Hawaii, is a Christian, has quite significant concerns about socialism and Marxism, and then comes in at one level preaching for the prospect of democracy, but not really trusting what you might call unbridled democracy. Mm-hmm. How did you see Sun Yat? And he talked about what he called his three principles of nationalism, the rights of people, and the livelihood of people, mm-hmm. and how to create this balance. How do you see him as a historical figure? Where does he play in this drama?
Well, it's very interesting, Rob, because, you know, having spent my whole life in Chinese history, I always thought Sun Yat-sen was a bit of a dead end. You know, he participated in the overthrow of the Qing dynasty, was an advocate for Republican government, and China instead ended up in warlord chaos.
Yes.
And then Chiang Kai-shek took over, and that was another dead end. Got run off to Taiwan. But when I went back this time to look at him, I realized that he was actually quite interesting in the sense that the plan he wrote in his sort of two works of consequence really was the plan that it actually ended up being followed by every government since, namely, democracy's all well and good, and down the line, let's all aspire to be more democratic. We'll build a Republican government, but in the short run, China needs authoritarian control. It needs to be reunified. Its people need to be galvanized together. And the tonic to do that, in Sun's view, was nationalism. He didn't see it as dangerous. He saw it as exactly what Chinese lacked. Japan had nationalism and got strong. China was, as he described it, a dish of loose sand, a sheet of loose sand. Yes. And he wanted some binding agent. So for him, he saw the necessity for an indeterminate period of time of strong leadership to heal the wounds, develop China, allow it to become wealthy and powerful. And he thought at first it would be 9 years, then he thought it would be longer. Well, it turned out it took over a century. But actually that was the model, and you can look at the Chinese Communist Party and say, well, they're just part of this sort of authoritarian period. While China unifies itself, becomes wealthier, develops a middle class, becomes powerful. That's the development model. Now, what happens from here on in is another question.
Now, we talk about this humiliation at the hands of foreign powers. And there's a scholar at the Naval War College, SEM Payne, who writes about the intermingling between the three wars: the Second World War, the Sino-Japanese conflict, and the Civil War within China. And it seems after Sun Yat-sen's death, and culminating in the rise of Mao as the Japanese were weakened by World War II, that perhaps Mao's, how would I say, power related to that mission of purging the foreign imperialists once and for all, to restore at least national rule, suspicion of anybody who had received foreign education or had been involved in joint ventures or what have you. But doesn't that also put them back in a place where they're cut off from the technology and the adaptation, the borrowing of technique that's learned elsewhere?
Yeah, I think, early Chinese reformers, revolutionaries saw two challenges. One was to somehow free China from the predatory relationships it had fallen into with the great powers, including Japan, because it was so humiliating. I mean, they could not defend themselves. Again and again and again, they suffered defeat and had to yield. But the other great challenge that most of the people, not all, during the early 20th century struggled with was how to get China and break it loose from the suffocation of what they viewed as its traditional culture. This culture that changed rather slowly and grudgingly, very hierarchical, very orthodox. It's this Confucian culture. You studied the classics, took the exams, joined the imperial bureaucracy, plus ça change. And so Mao was an interesting figure because whereas many other reformers tried to reinvent China by struggling against its tradition, at the same time they were nationalists, its tradition was so strong. Nobody could break loose from it. And most people in the early 20th century viewed China's failure to develop and become wealthy and powerful because of the strangulating hold of traditional culture. Mao, on the other hand, Mao was a tough cookie. And he grew up during that period. And he also grew up at a time in a very strict sort of patriarchal family and society where the father rules, and he hated his father. It was constant rebellion against his father. For, personal dynamics were playing in there as well. So he had a double sort of antagonism towards the authority of the Confucian overlord father and traditional Chinese culture, values, society, even though he was steeped in them. And in many ways, one can look at his tenure after he came to power in 1949, the 50s and 60s, as acting out this desire to extirpate traditional culture, whether it's the relation of women to men, of Confucian culture, of leaders to subjects, all of these things which had very clear authority relationships described. And in a certain sense, as savage and as brutal and as hideous as his various campaigns to erase traditional culture in all its manifestations were, by the time he died and Deng Xiaoping came along, I mean, one can make the argument that he had actually broken China loose from its past. A daunting prospect. Thousands of years this culture had been going on and regenerating, and Mao Zedong, in very deep and profound ways, put a stake through its heart. So, when Deng Xiaoping came along, he didn't have to fight culture wars. And when he started bringing in marketization, bringing in incentive systems, and breaking up the old Maoist system of sort of rigid public holding of land and equality of pay and everything, there was not so much resistance against it as there would have been 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. So maybe, and this is all a hypothesis, you know, in this notion of kind of creative destruction, Mao's antipathy towards structures and tradition in the past enabled him to knock it down.
He excavated.
He did the demolition, so that in a certain sense, when Deng Xiaoping came along, the place was shovel ready for some new kind of project.
And one of the embodiment of that is in your chapter on Zhu Rongji.
Yeah.
Because this is a man who played a role, not unlike Alexander Hamilton. When I first started looking at China in the early, say mid-80s, the notion of central finance and the coherence of central finance was non-existent. The ability to collect revenue from the provinces and have a strong national government did not exist. And yet, Zhu Rongji, despite the location of, say, concentration of power in the municipalities, was able to engage in fiscal reforms, banking reforms that really increased the power of the central government and diminished the power of these traditional fiefdoms in the provinces. How could he do that?
Well, it's interesting. Zhu Rongji was premier in the 90s when Jiang Zemin was the party general secretary, which is the superior position. There's two systems in China, the government and the party. And as we, my co-author John Delury and I look back at sort of the last 30 years to try to figure out who were the seminal people and who was worth writing about, he kind of emerged to surprise us, because it was really he that sort of wrenched the economic and the financial system of China around. You have to remember that when Deng Xiaoping started his reforms in 1978-9, but really not until the early 80s, here was a country, there was no private property. All peasants were in communes. They didn't even own tools or animals.
Collectivized agriculture.
Everything was collectivized.
Yeah.
There was no incentive system. Everybody got paid the same or whatever they did. And Deng Xiaoping thought, this is not going to work. And so he fired the system up with incentives, allowed people, so he said it's okay for some people to get rich first. And so Zhu Rongji came along and had to kind of make sense out of this. Really was a counter-revolution in every regard against what Mao had been for. And part of what had happened was that when they handed out land to the peasants in the 80s that had been collectivized, things got very decentralized. So Zhu Rongji came in again and had to figure out a whole new structure for this sort of system of authoritarian capitalism, a relationship between the center between Beijing and the provinces, because before there had been no taxes or anything. You know, if you were a company in Hunan province, whatever you made, you sent to Beijing, and they might send back whatever they thought you needed to.
And the central bank was extending credit, essentially maintain social stability and
Yeah,
realize
there was-
through state-owned enterprise.
There were none of the institutions or mechanisms that we associate with any open society now. So Zhu Rongji confected this very interesting and actually quite new construct. You still had a lot of state-owned enterprises, but you also had private enterprises bubbling up everywhere.
But they had managerial incentives within the state-owned enterprises that indicated a premium on performance and efficiency.
Exactly. They had injected, whereas before didn't matter who you were a party secretary, you ran a factory, whatever the performance, it didn't matter. The state would subsidize you. Now, suddenly Deng Xiaoping had performance-based criteria for people who ran state enterprises. And this was revolutionary in its counter-revolutionary way. And so Zhu Rongji had to somehow put a containment vessel around all this, figure out what the proper relationship would be between Beijing and the outlying areas. How would the central government fund itself? What would it remand back to the provinces? How would the balance of power be reconstructed? And he did it subtly, artfully, and I should also say somewhat guilefully. But he actually, I think, left a legacy that even today is quite profound, and was, in a certain sense, an architect, unequaled of sort of economic reform in modern China's evolution.
But I sense this is a product of that excavation of Mao, because the way in which he accomplished redistribution of power as a technocrat within society, it was almost impossible to fathom.
It was, and I think most people didn't quite realize what he was doing. For instance, by way of re-centralizing, certain systems of income coming in from the provinces into the central government, until after he'd done it. But in a certain way, he also benefited by this massive sort of reservoir of pent-up energy that during the Mao era, sort of individual entrepreneurial instinct, that when Deng Xiaoping came along and then Zhu Rongji finally began to rationalize the system, had been built up to the point that when it got released, it was this incredible source of energy. It's sort of like a source of capital, but it was human energy of people who wanted to make something out of themselves, their lives and their families, but also, I think many of them also wanted to see something made out of their country.
Yes, once again, the rejuvenation.
This idea,
recovering from the national humiliation.
This was a theme ever since, even before Sun Yat-sen, Liang Qichao, the great reformer of the latter part of the 18th century, 19th century, early 18th. This idea of rejuvenation, hearkening back to the days, the halcyon days of China's strength and preeminence. And it bubbles up again and again and again in almost every thinker, including Xi Jinping today. The first thing he does when he comes to power in 2012 is he goes to the National Museum across Tiananmen Square from the Great Hall of the People, and he takes the whole Politburo to a show called, the Fuxing Zhilu, the rejuvenation of China. And he starts talking about a Chinese dream.
Like the American dream.
It's like the American dream, but the American dream is very much an individualistic dream.
Yes.
His dream has elements of individual initiative in it, but it is also very much a dream of national greatness. And in that sense, it's quite different. And a lot of foreigners thought, oh, this is sort of, what is this? This is nothing. This is just propaganda. But actually, again, when you look back through history, modern Chinese history, again and again and again, you see different people talking about their dream for China, a strong China, preeminent China, respected China. And I think she was tapping into that long sort of tradition.
Well, as we build the bridge from Zhu Rongji to the present, there's a passage in your book that I found just startling. Is when George H.W. Bush comes as a president to meet with Zhu Rongji, and he celebrates the privatization. And Zhu Rongji stops him in his tracks and says, "That's not what we're doing."
I know, it's so interesting. I mean, Westerners, and particularly Americans who do not have a particularly highly evolved appreciation of history. Sort of
Well, the end of history was that time.
Well, we actually had the end of history, and then who started it up again? Actually, it was the Chinese.
That's right.
But you know, we sort of blithely assume that everything is kind of going to become more like us. That we are the incarnation of the ideal, whether it's an economic system, a political system, you know, Enlightenment values.
There's kind of a mythology about Narcissus, isn't there?
There's
Somewhere
a
related
bit
to
of self-referential, you know, kind of a tendency in here. So when, you know, Bush asks or says to Zhu Rongji, he's so pleased to see privatization in China, and Zhu Rongji says that's not what we're doing. Well, it wasn't.
Right.
They didn't see this as just a way station to becoming like us, open economy, open society. He was groping towards, as was every other Chinese leader, a much different kind of system with much greater controls, to which they're not going to cancel the state-owned enterprises. They're not going to cancel government control over, you know, foreign investment or outgoing FDI. So this bespoke, it was a hint of that something different was up in China.
Yes.
But of course, Americans thought, you know, when the Chinese start talking about socialism with the Chinese characteristics, they just laugh and say, what kind of nonsense is that? But actually, it's trying to describe a different development model, a different aspiration, a different end goal, which isn't, you know, Morgan Stanley and Bear Stearns and AIG.
There's a wonderful passage in the beginning of Richard McGregor's book, The Party, where all the Wall Street executives come in, and one of the Chinese leaders looks and says, well, now you guys can see our model was right, yours was wrong.
Well,
maybe a little glib, because the rest of the book doesn't.
A little wishful thinking, but it actually, you know, they survived the last smash up, 2008-9, pretty well. Now, does that mean that they've arrived at the ultimate system? No, it'll keep changing. But it does mean that you've got to look at what China has accomplished, whether you're an ardent Democrat with a small d, which I consider myself to be, but with a certain measure of respect, that maybe the sequencing of how a society develops and gets to a higher stage of being does go through periods that are somewhat unbecoming to Enlightenment idealists, namely autocracy, authoritarianism. The real question is, you know, how do they continue to evolve?
And how responsive is the government to people, regardless of what we call it or what form? I think this is a fascinating, essentially, crossroads. The famous historian and scholar Arno Mayer, his first and really most powerful book in my thinking was called Wilson versus Lenin. It was about the Bolshevik Revolution and the threat that the new model of Lenin-based capitalism represented to all the private sources of power and concentrations of power around the world. And when I look at the Chinese dream, I don't think the Chinese dream is to be emulating American democracy. And when you look at the world today, like the formation of the Institute for New Economic Thinking, financial instability, inequality and social instability, environmental degradation are not particularly good advertisements for the models of the West. We need to evolve. And the Chinese have this, I think there's a dangerous propensity when you've been humiliated, because the tendency toward vengeance or the tendency to emulate those who have harmed you by being strident and harmful yourself is very strong. You talk in the book about the relationship between coercive hard power and the kind of soft power that Joe and I talked about. Isn't there a Chinese dream in there, which you might call the better model, and maybe the better model that threatens the leadership of the West because it's different and contains more promise for human beings?
I think, you know, as we have entitled our book, Wealth and Power, I think at least the interim dream of China was that, to restore China to a place where it could feel proud of itself, to overthrow the tyranny of the abject loss of face and embarrassment and humiliation of being the sick man of Asia. And I think behind all of those yearnings was a deeper yearning yet for global respect. But we arrive now at the rather paradoxical situation where, having attained a substantial measure of wealth and power, China and its leaders still find the respect part of that yearning in short supply. And they're a little bit surprised. It's as if they were to say, you know, you said if we got wealthy and powerful, we could defend ourselves and stand up to you and we'd be okay. Now, why don't you respect us? Well, of course, the reason why the West doesn't readily respect China is because its political system is still very retrograde. And I think also because Chinese people themselves don't respect their political system. So they've arrived at this point where, after this Herculean effort to have revolutions, counter-revolutions, reforms, you name it, and they've made these amazing accomplishments, they still find the horizon retreating before them, and they wonder why. And the why is simply because finally there is something more than wealth and power that makes soft power credible.
You know, there's a nature of wealth that's not material.
Yeah, and you can't gain soft power by wealth and naked power alone, much less by bullying other people or even standing up for yourself. There's something else more ineffable about one's culture, one's political system, the way people are allowed to enjoy themselves, that is critical to soft power. And the Chinese government desperately want that soft power now. And we see them running all over the world trying to figure out, okay, how do we get it? Do we do a new TV station? Do we do Confucius Institutes? Do we give scholarships to Americans to come to China? I mean, they want to manipulate it, to organize it somehow, but actually it's something that is much more spontaneous, that they have trouble, I think, understanding. I believe it will come, but it isn't something that automatically follows the restoration of strength and wealth.
So as you finish this book, you're at some level warning them that the coercive nature of hard power, you can make people fear you but not necessarily respect you.
Or love you.
Yes. And this is a time where being respected and loved is actually probably what you might say eliminates the wounds.
Because it's such a global society that a really winsome, seductive, vibrant culture is very compelling.
And with rich philosophical traditions. You want to be the central kingdom again. It has to include all of those dimensions of wealth and power and love and respect in order to truly succeed. And my sense from reading your book is that you sense that they know that.
I think they know it and they fear it.
Yes.
They know something's still missing, and they're surprised, a little bit disappointed and annoyed that, having done this massive exertion over the 20th century, they still find themselves not arrived on the promised shore. And which isn't to say that America is on the promised shore, but America does have a very vibrant and compelling culture, and its soft power transcends its government, transcends even its economy. And that's what Chinese really, I think, desperately now want. And I think it's going to take some other kinds of changes and reforms that they're not accustomed to. China's a control society. It has a kind of a masterpiece of Leninist capitalism. You mentioned Lenin and Wilson. Well, you know, Lenin was interesting and important because it taught people how to organize a party that was well structured, could get the job done with a big leader at the top. Okay, you get the job done, you get your trains, your airports, your highways, your infrastructure, modicum of wealth. Then you get to the old Monty Python question, you know, the meaning of life. What now?
Yeah.
And that's where the Chinese are beginning to get to.
Yeah.
The danger, of course, is that, you know, they will become impatient with, you know, and want to get into sort of payback time, particularly in regard to Japan, countries that have really abused them, and that their nationalism will turn against them, and they will become truculent, as they sometimes can be. And in that sense, maybe sour this amazing exertion, this amazingly successful effort to reinvent their country and to reinstate it. That's a huge danger for them.
Yes, yes. Well, I want to thank you and your co-author, John Delury. This is an extraordinary book, and thanks for coming and talking with us today.
Well, great, Rob. Great pleasure.